Session 3, the kingdom tears asunder. Very dramatic. And in fact, it is. Let's take a look at today's agenda. First, we're going to do a quick review, as we always do. And then we're going to go into the reign of Solomon and how, in fact, the kingdom tears asunder. And then enter the villains, Ahab and Jezebel. Okay, so last week and a little bit the week before, we were talking about the stories in Samuel and Kings from a historical standpoint. And what we learned was that in the kingships of Saul and David, the office of prophet played an essential role as an intercessor between Yahweh and the king. Samuel was the prophet during Saul's kingship, and Samuel and Nathan both were prophets during King David's kingship. God rejected Saul, and David and his dynasty became God's champion. Then David offended God's honor in the incident of David and Bathsheba by killing her husband Uriah and committing adultery with her. The prophet Nathan expresses God's displeasure to David, and David immediately repents. God punishes David, but because of his immediate repentance, he maintains him and his dynasty as the chosen one. However, there are punishments that ensue to his children, but God punishes his children, not David. David's, with the exception of the fact that, of course, punishing your children is also punishing you. And of course, Rabbi Perlman brought up the last time, which was an important question about the skipping of generations and why the children were being punished for the sins of their parents. And that remains an open question. Then we read about Bathsheba, who, along with Nathan, ensures that her son, who is David's third son, succeeds to the crown. While the king may have many wives, the most important one is the mother of the future king. And the role of the queen mother was a powerful one. Those are what we learned from the historical standpoint. From a theological standpoint, it appears that the author, editor, compiler of these texts, known as the Deuteronomic historian, deeply believed in the laws and attitudes set out in the book of Deuteronomy. And most importantly, among those was the worship of the Israelite God was based in the theology of belief in a monotheistic God, that is, God is one. Another important part of that theology is the theology that God will name the place where he will be worshiped. So that becomes important when we have a temple in Jerusalem. Idol worship was sinful and would result in significant punishment from Yahweh. The reign of Solomon. For once, I have a little exercise. Before we get into this material, I'd like you on your own piece of paper to list 3 words that come to mind to describe Solomon the king, Ahab, and Jezebel. At the end of the session, I'd like you to look back at these descriptions and see if you would change or add to your list. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do that. And because it is interesting. These are iconic characters. And I know before I really got into the weeds, I had particular opinions about them or descriptions that I had of them in my mind. And some of those things changed. So I'm going to assume that everybody was able to do that and move along. If anybody needs me to stop for a little longer, I will. Okay. Let's talk about the reign of Solomon. Under the kingships of Saul and David, the Israelite nation was a relatively small one surrounded by enemy nations and seemingly always at war. However, with the enthronement of Solomon, we find a much different nation. one that is described with a powerful king, respected far and wide for his legendary wisdom, and a nation engaged in international diplomacy. Of course, it was still a very small nation, but there were things going on with Egypt. There were things going on with the Phoenicians. It really became a nation in international trade. And we find out very early in Solomon's story that he allied himself by marriage with Pharaoh, with the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he did that through, alliance, like many royal alliances, came as a result of a marriage. And he brought Pharaoh's daughter to the city of David, to quote unquote Jerusalem, to live there or nearby Jerusalem until he had finished building his palace and the house of the Lord, the temple, and the walls around Jerusalem. The marriage itself does not appear to offend Yahweh, as demonstrated by the following of Solomon's dream. As I do every week, I try to introduce art that I think would be interesting. And there are so many images of Solomon. This one I thought was particularly interesting because it's by a Spanish artist who also painted images of the Inquisition. And I thought, how inapt. Anyway, so what happens in Solomon's dream? At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I grant you?" And Solomon said, "You dealt most graciously with your servant, my father, David." Okay. Epithets, your servant, God's servant, and Solomon's father. Because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in integrity of heart. You have continued this great kindness to him by giving him a son to occupy his throne, as is now the case. And in the dream, Solomon asked God for wisdom to govern. Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad, for who can judge this vast people of yours? So Solomon is respectful of God, speaks in an honoring way to God, and as you will find in much of the Solomon story, there's a lot of exaggeration, which speaks to the fact that this is a royal story, and there's much exaggeration in many royal stories. Think about the story of Ahasuerus and how many people were at his parties. So when Solomon says this vast people of yours, it wasn't such a vast number of people, but it is a way to demonstrate Solomon's deference to God and the power of God. God is impressed by Solomon's relatively humble wish and grants him wisdom and more. And I also grant you what you did not ask for, both riches and glory all of your life, the like of which no king has ever had. Again, a sort of a very exaggerated statement. And I will further grant you long life, but if you walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David. Now, we can see that even in this early part of the text, that David is being rehabilitated totally. There's no more discussion of David and Bathsheba. There's no longer discussion of punishments of David. David is the hero king par excellence. And I was really trying to figure out why the text changes so radically, and David becomes so, for the lack of a better word, sainted. And I actually asked Rabbi Mishkin about it, and I don't know the answer. And if somebody does, the only thing I can think of is that there was some change in authorship, and also that the fact of the transition to a more international kingdom, that everything just had to be great and good and fine. Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem as the home for the Ark of the Covenant and the central place for the people to worship Yahweh. Until this time, you should know, they had worshiped God at multiple shrines. And following completion of the temple, God speaks to Solomon a second time, and God consecrates the temple as his own and restates his conditional attachment to David's dynasty as follows. Excuse me. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked before me, wholeheartedly and with uprightness, doing all that I have commanded you and keeping my laws and my rules, then I will establish your throne of kingship on Israel forever, as I promised your father David by saying, your line on the throne of Israel shall never end. But if you and your descendants turn away from me and do not keep the commandments and the laws which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will sweep off Israel off the land which I gave them. I will reject the house which I have consecrated to my name, and Israel shall become a proverb and a byword amongst all people. Clearly, this text was written much later than whenever Solomon may actually have reigned. And we see, in fact, a prelude to what will happen later on when the people do reject, when God feels rejected by the people, and they end up from the northern kingdom in Assyria and from the southern kingdom eventually in Babylonia. The verse suggests, and importantly, that the future of the people is dependent on the behavior of the king. And this is one of those playing cards that were published, in this case, by the Providence Lithograph Company. However, God's honeymoon with Solomon does come finally to an end. Surprise. Because, why? Because Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, the Moabite, the Ammonite, the Edomite, the Phoenician, and Hittite women. These are all traditional, the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites were traditional enemies of Israel, as were the Hittites. From the nations from which the Lord has said to Israel, none of you shall join them, and none of them shall join you, lest your heart turn away to follow their gods. Such Solomon clung to and loved. Such meaning these women Solomon clung to and loved. So the concept of foreign women and foreign women creating a problem is introduced early on. The concept that, in his old age, then we learn that in his old age, Solomon's wives turned away Solomon's heart after other gods, and he was not as wholeheartedly devoted to God, the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Again, his wives turned him away. First of all, he had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines. Again, a major exaggeration, telling us, of course, that this is not a true history. But it is his wives who supposedly turned his heart away. He turns to the women, and the women then turn him away from God. Interestingly, I think in this verse, it says in his old age, because it reminds me of David reaching his old age in the story with Bathsheba. But in his old age, David never turned away from God. In fact, he maintained the relationship with God and maintained his relationship with Nathan. Not Samuel, however. Another thing we might want to remember is that in the Deuteronomic text, in the laws of Deuteronomy, God never really did want a king. He felt that he was sufficient to be a king, and he was very concerned that kings not have too many horses, not have too many wives, not have too much money, and unless he gave it to them. But Solomon seems to have broken all of these rules. So Solomon did what was displeasing to the Lord and did not remain loyal to the Lord like his father David. Importantly, Solomon built shrines for all his foreign wives who offered and sacrificed to their gods. He even built a shrine for Moloch. And we know from the text, and we also know from archaeological evidence, that those who worship Moloch were most likely engaged in child sacrifice. So it was kind of the worst kind of idolatry. So the fact that Solomon built these shrines, it's one thing to be married to these women. It's one thing for these women to follow their own gods. It's another thing when Solomon starts building shrines for all these women, because the shrine is obviously, as the temple is, the place where the god head resides, for lack of a better word. And I love this picture. This is from the Children's Book of Bible Stories, which I found on the website for the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's great. You just pick a subject, put the subject in, write, let's say, Solomon, Solomon's women's images, and that's what you get. All kinds of images I get from all different periods of art. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him about this matter not to follow other gods. He did not obey what the Lord had commanded. We can really hear the voice of the Deuteronomic historian here. We can really hear the voice of a theologian, historian, writer who was dedicated to monotheism. And the Lord said to Solomon, because you are guilty of this, you have not kept my covenant and the laws which I enjoined you, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it away from your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give your son one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So again, David is lionized, so to speak, because remember, God had chosen David. And as I mentioned last week, David was God's second choice. But once God had made that second choice, he was heavily invested. So it's important to now speak as highly of David as one can from a Deuteronomic historian perspective, but also to recognize that if the king commits evil, the king will suffer for it. Also, what you will notice here is that it's not just for the sake of my servant David, but it's also for the sake of Jerusalem. The land which God promised to the Israelites and which they now occupy was a gift. And the land is as important, if not more important to God than the people. Because God does not want the people to be sinful on the land, because it actually then pollutes the land. So this appears throughout the Bible. So it's very important to understand that it wasn't just the people, but it was also the land, and God would be willing to save the land at the expense of the people.
Excuse me, Annette.
Yeah.
Where do these quotes come from exactly? Could you tell us?
This is from, sorry. Yeah, this is the one chapter I didn't put the chapter on.
I looked for it and see it. Right.
I'm sorry?
I looked for a citation. I didn't see one. That's why I asked.
Yeah, this one, I'll have to get that to you later, Sandy. I'm sorry. But it's in there. It's in the Bible for sure.
Was it in Deuteronomy?
No, this is in Kings.
That's from the Kings.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in the book of Kings.
Right. I thought it was from because this is after the after.
Right. Yes, all of these quotes are either in the book of Kings. There's out there. There is a Kings 1 and
Kings 2, but you don't know which is Kings 1.
This one is Kings 1, I believe.
I'll find it. It's okay.
Yeah, this one is Kings 1, but I don't know the chapter. I can get it to you at another time. The reason why it's denoted Kings 1 and Kings 2, or Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, actually is for a very practical reason. It had to do with how big a papyrus could be. And so there was too much to be said about Kings and about the stories in the book of Samuel to fit on one papyrus. So they fit on two papyruses. And that's why we have Kings 1, Kings 2, or Samuel 1, Samuel 2.
Annette,
yeah.
In 1 Kings chapter 9 is the part about the second dream. So you can go from there.
Okay. All right.
Could I ask you talk about the Deuteronomist? Does that mean that they think this was written by the same person as wrote Deuteronomy?
Okay, so the thinking is that much of this was written during the reign of King Josiah, which I believe was around 700 BCE. And that was when this group of writers came together and, yes, wrote some of Deuteronomy and some of this history. It wasn't the story of David, the story of Solomon was not written at the time of David and Solomon. It was probably written later. And the book of Deuteronomy is even timed for the period of King Josiah, because in the story of Josiah, what happens is that some of his courtiers end up finding a cave in the palace, and in this cave is the book of the laws, which is the book of Deuteronomy. Great story, great little story, but there it is.
It's probably not true.
I don't know. Probably not. But anyway, interesting.
The first dream is in chapter 6.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. That's great. I knew I could rely on you.
Barbara could look it up.
Okay. Okay, so now, following the description of so what happens after Solomon's reign is that his son Rehoboam takes the throne, but what has happened is that in the course of, and we've talked about this a little bit, in the course of the building of the temple, in the course of the building of Solomon's palace, there were all kinds of taxes imposed and all kinds of slave labor imposed. And many of the people were very unhappy. And in addition, in addition, because the Temple in Jerusalem became the place to be, to worship God, the smaller shrines that were up north, the priests had a little bit of problem with their job security. So a group of people revolted and became what is called the Northern Kingdom under Jeroboam. And the text includes a long and bloody sequence of chronic political instability involving court conspiracies, assassinations of kings, and usurpations of the throne. In the late 9th century BCE, the Northern Kingdom was first ruled by King Omri. At the same time that the kingdom of Judah was ruled by Asa, Solomon's great-grandson, a religious reformer. And I find it interesting. These are an artist in the 1500s had a book with historical and biblical characters. And I find it interesting that Asa is pictured as a handsome, thoughtful man, whereas Omri is pictured as a prototypical, in the prototypical anti-Semitic fashion of having a large nose and being dark and having, slanted eyes. I find it interesting that the pictures reflect the texts. So Omri did what was displeased, even back then in the 1500s, that these caricatures existed in the 1500s. Omri did what was displeasing to the Lord. He was worse than all who preceded him. He followed all the ways of Jeroboam, and Jeroboam who was the first king of the northern kingdoms, and the sins which he committed and caused Israel to commit, vexing the Lord, the God of Israel, with their futilities. Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and his son Ahab succeeded him as king. So that's why I had to give you this little bit of history, because we had to get to Ahab. And as you can see, this is 1 Kings 16. So some of this other stuff that I read before is somewhere in between 8 and 16. Okay. Ahab, son of Omri, did what was displeasing to the Lord more than all who had preceded him. He is one bad dude. Not content to follow the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he took a wife, Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Phoenicians, and he went and served Baal and worshiped him. Okay, so we had Solomon, right? And Solomon took one of the Egyptian princesses to be his wife because it was a diplomatic marriage. I'm sure that at the same time, this was also a diplomatic marriage, but what's the difference? What do you see as the difference? And just to note, King Ethbaal's name includes the name Baal, who was the god of the Phoenicians. So Ethbaal is like the man of Baal, man of God. But do you see a distinction here between the Solomon story and this very beginning of the Ahab story? Anybody? Well, the distinction that I see is that in the beginning of the Solomon story, when he brings the Egyptian princess, that is not when he begins to worship other gods. It's only later on in his life. Whereas when we're talking about Ahab, we know right off the bat, the reason why he is so evil and displeasing to the Lord is that not only did he bring this woman, but he began to serve her gods. Just as a note, Jezebel is an anglicized transliteration of the Hebrew Izebel, and Jezebel can be translated as the wife of Baal or Baal exists. Those are two possible translations. Not only did Ahab worship Baal, but he also erected an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And he made a sacred post. These were, I think I mentioned last week, these were posts that appeared in different shrines. They were just posts. They weren't idols, but they were considered sacred. And they have been found, archaeologists have found such posts. And Ahab did more to vex the Lord, the God of Israel, than all of the kings of Israel who preceded him. So from what we know here, Ahab is the arch-villain king. And why is the arch-villain king? Because he worships idols. Therefore, for the Deuteronomic historian who's writing the history of the winners, Ahab is clearly a loser. Suddenly, in the text, out of nowhere, the prophet Elijah appears. And remember, the relationship between kings and prophets is very important. It remains very important. His prophecy is brief. Elijah the Tishbite, an inhabitant of Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord lives, the God of Israel, whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain except at my bidding." Now, it's important to know this. In other words, God was imposing a drought on the land of Israel. And this is important because Baal is often characterized as the storm god. So essentially, God is saying Baal his powers don't apply here because I'm the one who's going to keep the rain from coming. Ahab's idolatry becomes deadly when Jezebel begins murdering the prophets who support Yahweh. So not only is he spiritually corrupt, but now from a legal perspective and from a moral perspective, the corruption is endemic. And sometime later, though, Elijah himself had the Baal priests slain. There was a contest between the priests of Baal and the priests and Elijah's priests. And they were competing to see who the prayers of whose people would incite their God to ignite a bull offering, Baal or Yahweh. So there was a whole contest with these people yelling back and forth at their God to ignite a bull offering. And surprise, surprise, Yahweh won. And Elijah encouraged the people to slaughter the priests of Baal. And when Jezebel heard this, she angrily swore to have Elijah killed, forcing him to flee for his life. So it's a much longer story than I could include in these slides, but it's worth looking at. But the point being, Jezebel has been murdering prophets. And then Elijah comes along, and in support of Yahweh, he incites this contest. And then not only does he win the contest, but then he has these priests slain. And actually, I was talking to Rabbi Mishkin about this yesterday because I said, why does it bother us that Jezebel begins murdering prophets? And then Elijah creates this contest, but not only does he win the contest, but then he murders the prophets of Baal. And we really didn't come to an answer, but I think it's a question that kind of disturbs me. And it's a question, and the rabbis sort of thought we had to look at it as a question of moral equivalency. Were the priests of Baal spouting religion that resulted in harm to other people in terms of sacrifices and the like. But it's an interesting question to me. I don't know if anybody has a comment about it right now. Okay. Something to think about, though.
I have problems with it. I think it's problematic. It's one of the problematic things that occur. I don't think there was any reason to start slaughtering prophets. They won the contest. So that should have been sufficient. And I think the fact that they were slaughtering, to me, that's evil. So I have a problem with it.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's something that we have to, it's in our text, so it's something that we have to make our peace with, I guess. Frightened.
Excuse me. I just wanted to say something that you said earlier, that the Deuteronomist, historian or redactor, he evidently felt that God, it's a theological position. There's no other God. It's monotheistic. And not only that, the land is sacred. And so everything else goes by the board. And the story of Elijah plays right into that. And by the way, if you don't want to read it in the Bible, go listen to the oratorio Elijah by Mendelssohn, in which contains the line, take all the prophets of Baal, that's how they pronounce it in English, and let not one of them escape you. Just saying.
Thank you. I love when we bring this in from other areas in our lives. So, yeah, I mean, but also, I mean, we've seen this concept of killing in earlier parts of Deuteronomy and in Joshua and Judges, when in fact, before the people were supposed to enter the land, they were supposed to basically slaughter all of the Canaanites. And this was truly to ensure that there be this monotheistic land in Israel. This isn't the first time we hear about this concept of murder and slaughter.
I have a problem with all of them, and also with Saul. Was what Saul did wrong. He saved the life of the king, and that was his big sin, was saving the life. He didn't want to kill the opposing king after he captured him. I have problems with that, because that's evil to me, and I don't think God wrote the Torah or the Bible, and I think this was whoever the Deuteronomists were that were doing the editing. I think maybe they didn't have a problem with that, but I do. That's my position.
No, and it's an appreciated position, and it's good that you can still read this and take from it what is important to you and what makes sense to you. And I think we all do that. I think we all read through this and have parts of it that really upset us. And I will tell you, when I was talking with Rabbi Mishkin, I wish he has to teach Hebrew high school, so he couldn't be here. And Sharon, Rabbi Perlman, was going to see family. So I wish one of them could be here, because this is truly theologically challenging. But I will tell you, if you ever want to discuss it with the rabbi, he's also troubled by many different things in the biblical text, and is very, very articulate in explaining what they are. So if you ever have any questions, what I'm trying to say is go ask the rabbi. Anyway, and he loves to talk Torah always. So I highlighted the word frightened because it points to how powerful Jezebel must have been. For Jezebel for the head prophet of Israel to be so frightened that he has to go south to Judah, right? He's leaving Israel. she must be a very powerful person. And we know she's a very powerful person because she's the daughter of a very powerful person, the king of Phoenicia, which was by the way, which was a very powerful civilization in ancient times. This wasn't any like little kingdom somewhere. This was a big and important nation. And so she had her own form of yichus, and enough gravitas that she could even frighten Elijah. Another indication of Jezebel's power is the story of Naboth. And this is a one-piece story, so bear with me. Ahab said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard so that I may have it as a vegetable garden. Since it's right next to my palace, I will give you a better vineyard in exchange, or if you prefer, I will pay you the price of the money in money." Kings in those periods like to have gardens. They really did. And so this is what he's asking for. He didn't want it, keep it as a vineyard. And Ahab was actually willing to pay for it, or even give Naboth a better vineyard. So that's quite a deal, wouldn't you think? And Naboth replied, "Nope, the Lord forbid that I give up to you that which I inherited from my fathers." And in fact, that is true. The law would not allow a person to sell family land. The land had to stay within the family. There's a lot that's written about the economics of these times, and the fact that the aristocracy was taking the land from poor people, but it's more than I can get into right now, but it's an interesting subject. But there's nothing here that says that Naboth was poor. It's just something that Ahab wanted. Interestingly, this is Ahab, who we think of as this terribly evil king. But at the same time, what he is doing, he's willing to give fair exchange. He doesn't just come in and take the land. He is willing to pay for it. And but from that perspective, he's also not being respectful of the law, which he should have known, which is that people could not give up their inherited land. So then Ahab went home dispirited and sullen because of the answer that Naboth the Jezreelite had given him. "I will not give you what I have inherited from my fathers." And he lay down on the bed and he turned away his face and he would not eat. A perfect description of a depressed person. So here is this person that we've been told is the epitome of evil, and really he's depressed.
He's also like a little child who's having, if you don't give me what I want, I won't eat. He sounds like a little kid. That's one way to look at it. Yeah, he was a spoiled little kid, but he was dispirited and sullen. So he was dispirited. I mean, I think it was more than just being a spoiled child. I think he was, and why we are given this information here, I'm not sure. Why he goes from being this powerful, bloody, evil king, except perhaps that the Deuteronomists wanted to malign him. And also because he has to be this kind of person in order for Jezebel to come in and do what she does, which we'll find out what she does now. His wife, Jezebel. Okay, so Jezebel is the wife of the king. She's never referred to as queen, but she is the wife of the king. She came to him and asked him, "Why are you so dispirited that you won't eat?" And so he told her, "I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and proposed him
as he did, sell me for money, or if you prefer, I'll give you another vineyard in exchange. But he answered, I will not give my vineyard to you. And his wife Jezebel said to him, now is the time to show yourself as king over Israel. Rise and eat something and be cheerful, and I will get the vineyard of Naboth and the Jezreelite for you. So here's another example we see of Jezebel's power. This daughter of a very famous king who comes to this new land, marries this king, and basically takes over. Jezebel writes the elders and dignitaries of Jezreel under the king's seal, asking them to bring 2 false witnesses. So she comes up with this scheme, and she tells the dignitaries of Jezreel, who probably were afraid of her also. If Elijah was afraid of her, then probably the rest of the populace was afraid of her. And she asked them to bring 2 false witnesses to claim that Naboth had cursed the king and God. Such behavior signifies treason. And they, in fact, did this. They brought these 2 false witnesses, and they got them to say that Naboth had cursed the king and God. And then Naboth was stoned to death per the king's instructions. And of course, it wasn't the king's instructions, it was Jezebel's instructions. So not only does she has it all figured out, and it's not below her to lie. It's not below her to have someone killed. Interestingly, and I really didn't think about this until just right now, so I have to think about it a little further, but when we think about David having Uriah killed so that he could have what he wanted, here we have Jezebel having an innocent killed so that she can have, and the king can have what he wants. And word was sent to Jezebel, even though the directive supposedly came from the king, the word was sent to Jezebel. So it was very thin. Naboth has been stoned to death. Everybody knew it was her. She obviously was a very powerful woman. And as soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, go take possession of the vineyard, which Naboth the Jezreelite refused to sell you for money. For Naboth is no longer alive, he is dead. And when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab set out for the vineyard to take possession of it. Then the word of the Lord, Elijah comes back in again. All of a sudden, comes up from the south. Go down and confront King Ahab of Israel, who resides in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard. He has gone there to take possession of it. And Elijah goes to Ahab and he protests. Thus says the Lord, you have killed and you have also taken possession. He prophesies that dogs will lick the blood of Ahab's corpse, just as the dogs have desecrated Naboth's corpse. And he says that Ahab's male descendants will die prematurely, his dynasty will perish, and that the dogs shall devour Jezebel in the flat land of Jezreel. Does anybody does this phrase, have you killed and also taken possession, does this remind you of anything that we've studied so far?
Well, the David story,
right? Right. David kills Uriah and takes possession of his wife.
But to give David the benefit of the doubt, he didn't really want to put Uriah in a position where he was going to get killed. He tries to convince him to go and have sex with his wife. And Uriah says, no, I'm going to go. Uriah, he refuses to do it. So David had no choice. Because if he wouldn't have, then Bathsheba would have been killed. So he had no choice. He really didn't want to do it. This is different. Jezebel does this cold-bloodedly and maliciously, and she doesn't have any feeling toward that what she's doing is evil. So they're two different I would give David more. What David did was wrong too, but not as bad as this.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I think that's an excellent point. I think my only point was that murder and taking what doesn't belong to somebody are things that are moral and are moral wrongs that God is very opposed to. Okay, so when Ahab heard these words, he rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his body. He fasted and he lay in sackcloth and he walked about subdued. Again, reminds us a little bit of David's behavior after God after Nathan reprimands him according to God's words. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the disaster in his lifetime. I will bring the disaster upon his house in his son's time. The analogies are there, all of a sudden, and what I think that this text shows us is the importance of assuming guilt, and that for God is of primary importance. That for the Deuteronomist is of primary importance. Slachli, forgive me. What we do every year on Yom Kippur. Ahab does not die peacefully, as these words might suggest, but he does die bravely in battle, after which the dogs do lick his blood. His and Jezebel's sons, Ahaziah, succeeds to the throne for 2 years, and then he dies. And his brother, Jehoram, succeeds him, and he is killed by Jehu, the new contender to the throne. A few years later, Ahab perished in battle, as I just said, with the Syrians, but Jezebel lived on for approximately another 10 years. Elijah's successor, Elisha, the prophet, and there's many stories about them, which could be a whole class unto itself, who was equally determined to end Baal worship, and a military commander named Jehu, anointed to be king of Israel, and the act provoked civil war, for Jezebel's son, Joram, was the king. So just to review, both of Ahab and Jezebel's children, Ahaziah and Jehoram, are killed by Jehu. Jehu was appointed by Elisha, who was an anti-Baal priest, a priest of Yahweh. And what happens? When Joram saw Jehu, so the son saw Jehu, he said, "Is all well yet?" But Jehu replied, "How can all be well as long as your mother Jezebel carries on her countless harlotries and sorceries?" Thereupon Joram turned his horses around and fled, crying to Ahaziah, "Treason, Ahaziah." But Jehu drew his bow and hit Joram between the shoulders, so that the arrow pierced his heart, and he collapsed in his chariot. Jehu thereupon ordered his officer, pick him up and throw him into the field of Naboth, the Jezreelite. So everything comes around. Now Jehu is basically spitting in the face of Ahab, Jezebel, and the whole crew. And so to the extent that, but at the same time, the extent of Jezebel's power is evidenced by the necessity for Jehu, the founder of the next royal dynasty in Israel, to murder her before his rule can be established, even though her royal husband and sons are now dead. Another example of her power. So Jehu went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard of it, she painted her eyes with kohl and dressed her hair, and she looked out of the window. She's in the palace, and she looks out the window. And Jehu entered the gate, and he called out, and she called out, "Is all well, Zimri, murderer of your master?" And she's referring here to a king who existed, an assassin of a reigning king who the army of Israel refused to accept Zimri as a legitimate king and instead elects the commander Omri. Ahab's father is a rival candidate. So essentially she's talking about this assassin. He looked up toward the window and said, "Who was on my side? Who?" And 3 of the eunuchs leaned out toward him and they said, "Throw her down." And he said, "Throw her down." And they threw her down and her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses and they trampled her. A real ignominious ending. Then he went inside and ate and drank, and he said, "Attend to the cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." So they went to bury her, but all they found of her were the skull, the feet, and the hands, because the rest of her had been eaten by dogs. And they came back and reported to him, and he said, "It is just as the Lord spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. The dogs shall devour the flesh of Jezebel in the field of Jezreel, and the carcass of Jezebel shall be like dung on the ground in the field of Jezreel, so that none will be able to say, 'This was Jezebel.'" I think this drawing is a really cool drawing. It's by an American who was born in 1940, and he did many scenes from the Bible, but this one I thought was particularly interesting. Okay, so who is Jezebel? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines Jezebel as the Jezebel that we know from the Bible, and also, often not capitalized, an impudent, shameless, or morally unrestrained woman. Also, it's notable that the Jezebel stereotype was used during slavery as a rationalization for sexual relations between white men and Black women, especially sexual unions involving slavers and slaves. The Jezebel was depicted as a Black woman with an insatiable appetite for sex. She was not satisfied with Black men. The slavery era Jezebel, it was claimed, desired sexual relations with white men. Therefore, white men did not have to rape Black women. In other words, the sex was consensual. So Jezebel is the epitome of evil in modern culture. And Rabbi Mishkin shared this with me. In 2013, the OU, the Orthodox Union, required a Manhattan restaurant to change its name from Jezebel, the name of the biblical figure associated with immorality, in order to retain its certification. There was a line before that I didn't comment on, but I thought was when Jehu basically says to Joram, "How can all be well as long as your mother Jezebel carries out her countless harlotries and sorceries?" Here's the use of the word harlot, which implies sexual activity. But harlotry in the Bible often refers to idolatry. But I think in common modern culture, people don't think of Jezebel in that way. They think of her as a sexual temptress. Well, then, as I was preparing for this class, I found out that there's been a lot of rehabilitation of Jezebel. So, and there actually was rehabilitation all the way back in the days of the rabbis. So, despite their generally negative description of Jezebel, the rabbis did not refrain from enumerating her merits when she was worthy of praise. When Elijah forecast Jezebel's end, he prophesied, "The dogs shall devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel." And this prophecy is only partially fulfilled because, as we know, they left her feet and her hands. And the Midrash explains that these parts remained because of the acts of kindness that Jezebel performed with them. Jezebel's home was close to the marketplace, and whenever a funeral procession passed by, she would come forth from her house, strike her hands, lament with her mouth, and walk 10 paces. When a bridegroom passed through the marketplace, she would come out, clap her hands, call out with her mouth, and walk 10 steps behind him. From the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the Midrash accounts teaches that God's rewards good deeds, even in a wicked woman, since the limbs that performed the laudable acts were the recipients of divine loving kindness. I guess what this story is telling us is that not everybody's all bad. Not everybody, not good people aren't all good, and that we have to look for the good even in people that we consider the worst. Even our friend Tikva, I wish you were my friend, Tikva Frymer-Kensky, who's the biblical commentator, has something relatively positive to say about Jezebel. She explains, as we talked about last week with Bathsheba, that motherhood is the first societal role of women in the Tanakh, and the second great societal role is that of wife. Women in the Bible have the role of supportive wives. Women help their husbands, whoever they might have to oppose, to do so. And that this picture of the supportive wife is consistent, so that even when the villainous Queen Jezebel acts as a model wife, when she steps in to help her husband realize his desires for Naboth's vineyard, defying Israelite limitation on her royal power. So even though there was law against it, her primary concern was her husband. And there's nothing in the story of Naboth that indicates that Jezebel wanted that land for herself. It's a personal kind of story. So she was acting as a wife in that story. Where we see her power being exercised is when she creates the ruse to get Naboth to be killed.
Excuse me, Annette.
Yeah.
Yes, with all apologies to Tikva Frymer-Kensky. So she was a powerful woman and she had great influence over her husband. She could have used that influence to talk him out of this crazy thing instead of going and getting the vineyard for herself. She could have used her strength and influence to get him something else that didn't involve murdering the whole family and all that. Or she could have just talked him out of it. Sorry about that.
No, please don't be sorry. And I'm glad you raised that.
I'm apologizing to the late
I think there's this as a real interpretation of the text, and she stays within the borders of the text itself. So really what she's saying though is she's not saying that she was a wonderful woman. She's just saying that she did what good biblical wives do, which isn't necessarily always the best. But Kensky writes elsewhere, the story of Jezebel's death reveals a woman of courage. Facing the murder of her husband's family, the queen makes herself up to look as best as she can and calls Jehu a murderer, comparing him to a long ago royal assassin who ruled only a week before being assassinated himself. She speaks with dignity and defiance and grace. Nevertheless, we readers almost cheer when her servants throw her out the window to be eaten by the dogs. I have read this in a number of sources now, that how Jezebel was determined to die as she lived, as with no excuses, and obviously she didn't dress herself and put on makeup to try to sexually attract Jehu. That's a ridiculous notion. But she was going to be the princess. She was going to be the supporter of Baal. It was her religion. She believed in it. She was going to be the good wife, and she was going to die without her family being disgraced. Herself.
With what Barbara said, there's enough. if she were a good queen, her servants would not have turned against her and thrown her out the window. The fact that they turned against her and were willing to kill her so easily indicates she probably treated them pretty badly. That's what it says to me.
Either that or they saw that the politics were changing. Either that or they were, they heard what was going on out in the street, and they knew that Jen was going to win, and they wanted to be part with the, they wanted.
I think if anyone who has servants, if you're a good master to your servants, they're not going to be that eager to kill you, even if politics are changing. I think a good queen would have been loved by her. So I'm thinking about when Cleopatra killed herself. Her servants wanted to die with her because they loved her.
Yeah.
So it's
she wasn't
a good queen. She wasn't good to her servants. That indicates that.
That's a very interesting point. I appreciate that point. Okay, Amy Kalmanowski, who was my Bible professor, and she's now the dean of Liss College and Keck's Graduate School at JCS, looks at Jezebel through the lens of gender. She writes, Jezebel may be the most maligned woman in the Bible. She certainly is among its most powerful women. David Jobling argues, she quotes from another scholar, that when strong women appear, the Bible seeks to diminish their power, even when it means detouring from other textual goals. For example, Elijah's fight for true religion becomes a crusade against the woman Jezebel. Gender transgressive Jezebel must be destroyed. The narrative shows her no mercy. In contrast, Samson and Ahab are buried as men among their ancestors, perhaps emasculated men, as they are less threatening than manned women, or perhaps though compromised as men, they demand some dignity. So there's a whole feminist approach to Jezebel that basically says, here was the strong woman. And her biography indicates that she was a strong woman, and that this is out of the norm for the biblical text.
I have a problem with that too. There are other strong women in the Bible, and they aren't made evil the way Jezebel is. What's the one who killed the guy with the tent pin? What about Deborah? There are a lot of strong women in the Bible, and they aren't maligned. I think sometimes the feminist movement goes overboard in trying to prove its point, and I think this is one instance of it. Sorry, I had to put this other in. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I said I'm sorry.
No. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. It's just these are different opinions about Jezebel. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the Women's Bible, she said, so why was it okay? Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Why was it okay for Elijah to murder all those prophets when it wasn't okay for Jezebel to do it? There's a lot of questionable things in some of these Bible stories and Tanakh stories, and it's something that we live with, and it's what makes the text challenging. It's what makes the text interesting, and makes the text something that we can study together. Anyway, take a look at your lists and see whether I'm curious whether your lists of words used to describe Solomon, Ahab, and Jezebel, and I'd be curious to know if people would change any of those words they wrote down or would add to them. And I'll let you can either keep it to yourself or share. That'd be great. But if there's no sharing right now, I just want you to know next week is our last week. And the question is, do I really want to be the child of a royal? We'll look at some stories of parents and children.
I just wanted to add something from my list. When I read the text about Jezebel, it says that her feet and her skull and her hands were left. But I don't know, I've been over my lifetime, I've been reading a lot of English mystery novels, and I think it might have been in Dorothy Sayers' novels, where Lord Peter Wimsey is quoting something or other about Jezebel, and it said that all was left was the palms of her hands. So apparently the Anglican Church somehow had that little midrash in there, that all that was left was the palms of her hands. Just thought you would like to know this. Doesn't say anything about the skull or the feet. Just some factoid.
I sort of feel that, Jezebel may be pretty wicked, but I think that the way that it seems like sometimes the men get off a little easier in the sense that, like Ahab, and also when Solomon, when he was older and he aligned with all these women and they were really bad women because they turned him away from God. Well, he turned away from God. It's like it was there. It's described as if they were just this very bad influence, but he was part of it. You know what I'm saying? It sort of emphasizes the point that this sort of a feminist view that it's, again, sort of the wicked woman. That's all.
It was written from the perspective of a patriarchal society. So how could you expect anything less? We've been maligned for centuries. The bad woman, the harlot, she led him astray. Didn't he have a mind of his own? I look at all of these stories and I chuckle because we're all so devious and horrible and so smart. And these men can't keep their pants closed, and they're off and doing whatever. And, and they're Mr. Wonderful, and the rest of us are, we're just no good. So what could I say? So I think there's a slight slant in the way the Bible was written, because we know it was written by men, and have this wonderful perception of themselves. But they wouldn't be here if it wasn't for us. So I think they should lighten up a little bit.
There's a biblical scholar that thinks the book of Jay was written by a woman, by the way. He wrote the book of Jay.
I did like to Annette's previous point, which was that these people believed in their own religions. That's it. They believed in those religions. And we see this in our modern age.
Go on with that, Barbara. Go ahead. We do see that. People have their own religions. And we have, in Port Washington, we have a clergy council, and everybody there is part of their own religion. And they are not trivial about it. They believe in their own religions. And some of those people who have different religions marry other people who have different religions. And who's at fault about that? That's in a lot of the literature that tries to rehabilitate, not tries to, but speaks to who Jezebel might really have been. And the concept that basically the Deuteronomic society, a society run under Deuteronomic rules, was basically a fundamentalist society. And so it's one fundamentalist society, it's exactly what you said. It's people who believed in their own God, they came together, and it was not cosmopolitan.
I was actually thinking of Solomon's wives, not just Jezebel.
Yes, and Solomon's wives. Absolutely. They did believe in their own religion. They all did. All right. So thank you again. Next week, we meet on Monday. Well, yes, next week we won't change it. We meet on Monday. same time, 7:30. And I thank you all. It's always
We
a pleasure.
thank you.
Thank you, Annette.
Thank you, Annette.
Yes.
Annette.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night and a good week.
So,
Yes.
Thank you.
bye.
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 Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.